Hi, my name is Graham Allison, and I'm happy to welcome you here to the forum tonight for discussion of a very important but quite dismal subject. Okay? Our topic is terrorism, indeed terrorism with weapons of mass destruction, or what we call here locally catastrophic terrorism. And we have the very good fortune to have tonight a panel of individuals who can open our eyes to the many dimensions of this topic, and I think stir our imaginations before the evening is out, to be sure. The panel, whom I'll introduce individually as it comes time to speak, but include Ash Carter, Rich Falkenrath, Elaine Kmark, and Matthew Messelson. The fifth member of our panel is stuck in an airplane, Josh Lederberg, but is not likely to be here tonight. But among other things, we were celebrating the publication of a book that Josh has edited as part of the BCSIA series, and we'll look forward to getting him back here in Cambridge on some subsequent occasion for those of you who happen to be particular aficionados of this topic. Let me take about 2 minutes to frame the issue, and then I'm going to introduce Ash, and then we'll begin to take turns here. First, point one, what is the single largest and most urgent or imminent threat to Americans' lives and liberties today and in the decade ahead? And my answer, and I think an answer that you'll hear reverberating through this panel, is terrorist attacks on Americans with chemical weapons or biological weapons or nuclear weapons. In President Clinton's announcement of his major initiative in January, February to increase U.S. government spending to address this problem, he offered his view that it is likely that Americans will be victim to such an attack in the not too distant future. And that's a view with which I agree. Members of the panel can offer their own views. Second point, is this threat of catastrophic terrorism, currently well identified by the U.S. government and other governments, and currently well addressed by the U.S. government and other governments? Again, our panelists will have much to say about this, but I'll telescope my answer to it, which is the answer is no. That a major objective of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs here at the school over the past half dozen years has been to try to help get this issue into focus. But it's a very hard issue to focus on because it's new and involves so many unusual dimensions and is part of an agenda that we're not accustomed to. But over the past several years, a number of books have been published, and as I mentioned, one of these, a book that we're celebrating the publication of tonight, that begins to address it. What one will hear in the comments of Ash and Rich and Elaine and Matt is the accounts of studies that are beginning to map not only the shape of this problem, but to prescribe, to ask what can be done, and even to help identify an agenda for action with respect to it, as befits the kind of work, the kind of research work that should go on here at the Kennedy School. So my final question in framing is, if you were interested in this topic, or if you become interested, what could you read and where could you get it? Okay? We're not allowed to sell books here, so we're not selling any books, but we're just telling you how you might get a book or a study if you were interested. And over on that table, there'll be you can see the names of the books and the phone number and email addresses, mostly at MIT Press, or if you're confused, you can always call BCSIA or look at its website to find, here in the Kennedy School, to find the books. Let me just mention the names of them briefly. These books that have come out in the last several years, books and studies, as part of this effort at BCSIA. The book that's just being published tonight is edited by Josh Lederberg. It's called Biological Weapons, Limiting the Threat. And this single volume offers you, as Bill Cohen's introduction says, the Secretary of Defense, virtually everything you wanted to know or were prepared to learn about biological weapons, but were afraid to ask. We then, chronologically, well, I don't know exactly which order I'm going on. Maybe I'll go in terms of our authors here. A study that was prepared by a study group here, co-chaired by Ash Carter and John Deutsch and Phil Zellico, is entitled Catastrophic Terrorism, Elements of a National Policy. This is a publication of the Preventive Defense Project here at the school and Stanford, and the Visions of Governance Project here at the Kennedy School. And this offers the views of a group of informed folks who struggled with the issue for some time, starting from the problem and asking what could be done. And Ash will have something more to say about that. An earlier version of this book, for those of you who just want to do nukes or loose nukes, is called Avoiding Nuclear Anarchy, containing the threat of loose nuclear fissile or weapons-usable material in Russia that I and Rich Falkenrath and Steve Miller and Owen Cote authored back in '96, and which some of you are familiar with. Then if you want kind of everything you want to know about an overview of the problem, Rich Falkenrath's book, which was just published this past year, is called America's Achilles Heel, Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical Terrorism and Covert Attacks. This is done by 3 fellows at BCSIA, Falkenrath, Newman, and Thayer. Ash Carter's book with Bill Perry is called Preventive Defense, A New Strategy for America, is not principally on this topic, but this topic arises as a major example of the kinds of problems that are dealt with there. And then finally, there's a second edition of a book that I wrote longer ago than I like to remember, called Essence of Decision on the Cuban Missile Crisis, the concluding chapter of which comes back to this topic. So people have sometimes said that there's a number of one-notes around here who seem to have only one topic on their mind, namely the topic of terrorism or terrorism with weapons of mass destruction. That's not quite true, but it is a topic that's come into focus at the Kennedy School and which we continue to try to address. So that frames the issue for you. If you're trying to figure out how can you read or learn more, over on that table you can find the places to find the books. But let me now turn to the first member of our panel, Ash Carter. Ash is a professor here at the Kennedy School, the Ford Foundation Professor of Science and International Affairs. He's the co-director with Bill Perry of the Harvard-Stanford Preventive Defense Project. From '93 to '96, Ash served as Assistant Secretary of Defense, and in an earlier incarnation was director of the Center for Science and International Affairs. So we'll turn first to Ash for about 6 minutes on the problem and what to be done.
Thanks very much, Graham, and thank you all for being here. Is this microphone on? It is? Okay. Let me start by observing that this subject about which this forum is not in the news tonight. What's in the news tonight is Kosovo. And in this book that Bill Perry and I wrote, we tried to ask ourselves, what is the essential nature in security terms of the era in which we live, the post-Cold War era? And that no good answer has been given to that question can be seen from the fact that we still refer to it a decade after it began as the post-Cold War era, which means we know whence we came, but not where we are or where we're going. And one of the things we try to do here is anticipate what the security future is for this country and for the world. And yet, if you looked at the newspapers today, or the television tonight, you would assume that Kosovo or Bosnia or, looking back a few years, Rwanda, Somalia, Haiti, that those issues characterized the security dilemmas of the era in which we live. And they are indeed important problems, but I would say that Kosovo, dangerous as it is, heartrending as it is, important as it is, doesn't affect the vital interests of the people living in this country, or the international order, or the position of this country in the world. And we, in fact, and this is what Bill and I say in this book, are blessed in that we live in an era in which the big problems like the problem that the Soviet Union posed to us during the Cold War, problems to our survival, threats to our survival, our way of life, our position in the world, don't exist now. And so we focus on other things. But the most important duty of those of us who think about security ought to be asking ourselves, what are the problems that in the future can recreate the magnitude of danger to our survival, our way of life, our position in the world, as big as the Cold War was in decades past. And I think we all believe at this table that catastrophic terrorism is one of those problems. So it hasn't happened yet, it's not upon us the way Kosovo is, but it's coming, and what are we doing to prepare ourselves about it? Now, by catastrophic terrorism, as Graham said, we mean terrorism not of the bombs in the marketplace, hostage-taking, airplane hijacking variety that has been familiar to us all since the Munich Olympics of a few decades ago, but something much bigger, orders of magnitude bigger, involving nuclear, biological, chemical attack upon the critical infrastructures that support the integrated, interdependent life we live, or attack upon the organs, the institutions of government with which we live. That's what we mean by catastrophic terrorism. Now, that's never happened before. Never happened before. But it's reasonable to presume that the probability of catastrophic terrorism is increasing. Now, Rich Falkenrath has written the book on this subject, and he'll be speaking in a moment and can describe to you why you ought to be worried about that. I'll pass over this, but I'll just tell you what I'm talking about. I'm talking about not about the disappearance of a building in Oklahoma City, but the disappearance of Oklahoma City, and not the Khobar Towers barracks in Dhahran, but Dhahran itself. And not about what these shadowy, transnational, messianic cults like Aum Shinrikyo in Japan or the World Trade Towers bombers actually did, but what they tried to do. Remember, what Aum tried to do was kill tens and hundreds of thousands of people with not only chemical but biological means. And what the World Trade Tower bombers aspired to doing was bringing down the whole damn thing, not just blowing up the parking garage. That's what we mean by catastrophic terrorism. And as I said, I can't prove that the probability of that is increasing, that an incident of this sort is in our future. But if you look around you and you think, there are a number of factors which indicate that probably we can surmise the probability is increasing. First of all, destructive power coming into smaller and smaller hands. Rich will say more about that later. Not so hard to do biological weapons, not so hard to do chemical weapons. Second, the vulnerability of our society. Third, the transnational character of our world, where international criminal gangs, drug traffickers, and so forth provide an infrastructure for transnational terrorism. The presence all around us of messianic or vengefully motivated groups that might resort to catastrophic terrorism. Let me just remind you, the Hamases and the IRAs are not going to do this kind of terrorism. They are intent upon a political agenda, which will one day legitimize them as a political force. You bring down an airplane, you might get there. You take out a whole city, people will never forgive you. So for these kind of groups that have a political motivation, catastrophic terrorism of the kind we're talking about here is overkill. And so it's the groups like that, those folks that put the purple cloth over themselves and brand new Nikes and went off to join the Comet's Tail a few years ago. It's that kind of group that's capable of catastrophic terrorism. And finally, we are militarily unequaled around the world. Anybody be crazy to take the United States of America on frontally, symmetrically, because if you're a conventional military machine, we will beat you. And so if you're trying to get America's goat or coerce this particular country, the only way to do it is to decide not to go frontally, but to find some other mechanism. So for all these reasons, it is plausible to surmise that the probability of catastrophic terrorism is increasing, and this kind of thing is in our future. It is orders of magnitude more destructive than terrorism we've experienced, and with the change in quantity comes a change in quality. If a city were to go away in this country, it would the next day abruptly bring home to Americans, for the first time in their experience since 1949, when Joseph Stalin exploded the A-bomb, the idea that we're vulnerable in our own homeland. That hasn't been part of our experience. You know, wars have been elsewhere. You go out, somebody causes trouble, you project power, you take care of them. They're somewhere else, they're not here. Second, these catastrophic terrorism is likely to be truly transnational, in that the groups like the World Trade Tower bombers are likely to be some American, some non-American, some American technology, some non-American technology, some American motivations, some non-American motivations. In other words, the us versus them problem gets complicated. The terrorists, the German terrorists of the 1970s and 1980s, recall, had the objective, their objective was to disgrace the German government, to undermine people's sense that the established order could protect them, or to provoke the authorities to repressive acts that would in turn discredit the government. So if an event like this occurs, you can imagine what the public reaction will be like. Where were the authorities who should have prevented it? How come they didn't clean it up when it occurred? And that leads me to fear the day after an event like this as much as I fear the event itself. Because I fear the reaction we will all have to an event like this. That advises me to get out in front of this problem before it's upon us, to anticipate a little, even though Kosovo is in the headlines, and to think about what we ought to do about this. A couple little dilemmas that my colleagues will resolve, but a few dilemmas that arise when one attempts to do this. First thing is the deep divide between, in our country, the law enforcement authorities and paradigm, which is you wait for somebody to commit a crime, then you go and arrest him or her, and the national security paradigm, which is you go out, you look for threats, you find them, you go after them early. This is a problem that falls right in the cracks of our institutional divide, and it raises very profound questions about whether we can both deal with this problem and live the lives that we all want to live and have the civil liberties we want to live. And I contend that I very much fear policies made in the aftermath of an event. If you remember when Lee Harvey Oswald was killed, people assumed, well, it must be Russian. Remember Reds under the bed in the 1950s, the last time we felt a foreign threat come home? So our own reactions as a society are not something to be depended upon. Second little issue for you to think about. Our Defense Department, our defense authorities have the preponderant capability to deal with chemical, biological, nuclear weapons. Why? Because they do that in the course of preparing to fight wars. So they are the natural people to call upon for this problem. And yet, when we bring the military home, that also raises deep and disturbing problems for us. And finally, and on this point I'll close, I don't think as a country have any experience in security, we have very little experience in security threats that come home, unlike, say, Israel and Great Britain, who have long lived, tried to run civil societies in the face of a terrorist threat. So I think we have to look at ourselves as very green, very naive, and very undependable in this matter. And that, to me, recommends that we divide our policy response in two parts. One, the things that we're comfortable doing now, and second, a different set of measures that we would be comfortable taking in an emergency, and we want to think through how we'll feel in an emergency now. and decide now how to strike that balance between living the kind of lives we want and living insecure lives under the threat of catastrophic terrorism. Make those decisions now, get out in front of this problem, deal with it the day before, now, and not the day after.
Good. Thank you, Ash. I think that helps get the issue into frame. The second speaker is Rich Falkenrath. Rich is Assistant Professor of Public Policy here at the Kennedy School. He served for 3 years just before that as Executive Director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs here. As I mentioned earlier, he was a co-author in the Avoiding Nuclear Anarchy project before, but for tonight's purposes, he is the lead author with 2 other fellows at the center of this book, America's Achilles Heel, Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical Terrorism and Covert Attack, which is a great compendium of, that provides an overview of the problem that has come to be recognized as, I think, basically the best single copy overview of a problem that's still coming step by step into focus. So, Rich Falkenrath.
Thank you, Graham, for that introduction and for your unstinting support of this research agenda. I'm going to make 3 points tonight. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I think about the threat, tell you what I think to do about it, and I'm going to tell you what I think not to do about it. First, the threat. Ash provides a great base, and I can be very brief. Let me just suggest a way for you all to think about this. If you make a list tonight of the top 100 things you're most likely to die from, I would suggest to you that catastrophic terrorism is probably not on there. But if you put yourself for a moment in the position of the Secretary of Defense or the National Security Advisor, and you make a list of the most likely single purposeful events to kill 1,000 American citizens or more, then this is on the top 3. And what that says to me, at least, is this is an issue of national security policy, not of personal safety. And it's very important, and it's a point I try to make always when I speak to public audiences about this. I don't think you need to go home tonight and buy atropine or a gas mask, but I do think that at the level of national security policy, this should be taken extremely seriously. I think of this threat as high consequence, but relatively low probability. The consequences, as Ash said, are off the chart, order of magnitude beyond what we've seen before. So the potential involved with weapons of mass destruction, at least. Probability, there is no way, as Ash said, to get a handle, an absolute sense of how likely this is. In my judgment, it's not enormously likely, but I'm quite confident in the conclusion that it is growing more likely with time, for the reasons Ash mentioned. And also, I think in terms of the technological barriers to doing this, to acquiring the weapon and using it, those are not trivial, but they're fixed with time. At the same time, the latent capacity of non-state actors to achieve complex technical tasks is rising with time. This is a function of social and educational progress. It's simply inevitable that over time, more and more non-state actors, including violent ones like the terrorist groups we know of, will be capable, if they wish, to carry out a catastrophic terrorist event if they want to. So, this is my summary of how to think about this threat. High consequence, low probability, national security matter, not a matter of personal safety, not yet. And let's hope it stays that way. Now, what to do about it? I've given a lot of thought to this, as has everyone on this panel, and I can't talk about the whole agenda. I just want to talk about one part, one particularly interesting part, and that is how to counter biological weapons. This is something if Joshua Lederberg had been able to, if his flight hadn't been delayed, I'm sure he would have focused on, since he has been a national leader on this. Biological weapons are unique among weapon types in that they're a disease. Not everyone realizes this, but what we mean when we talk about a biological weapon is a disease-causing microorganism that's disseminated through the air. You inhale it, it implants in the lungs, and it causes a disease in you. As a measure of weight, their lethality is without parallel in any other technology. A microscopic speck that you couldn't even see with the naked eye is enough to cause a lethal infection in you. In the air, when they're disseminated as an aerosol, they're invisible, odorless, and tasteless, and their effects, their symptoms are delayed. So it will be a matter of days often before you even realize you've inhaled the microorganism and it's causing a disease. This makes them an extraordinarily difficult weapon to counter as a matter of policy. But there is one point of leverage. It's a very interesting point of leverage, and it's one that's outside the box of conventional national security thinking. And the point of leverage comes from the fact that this is a disease, and we deal with diseases all the time. And if they're detected, they can often be treated. And so this is a very interesting case where national security policy starts to intersect with medicine and with public health. With biological weapons, if they're detected soon enough after an outbreak, it's possible, through prompt and effective action, to radically reduce the consequences in the human population that is infected. To do this, you need to detect it quickly, you need to have medicines on hand to treat it, and you need to have some system in place to disseminate those medicines. Now, these things are not hard. They actually have been articulated by the President as priority needs. As a relatively new development, and there's very early action going on in the government at the federal level and at the state and local level, where much of the resources reside, to deal with this. Now, to give you a sense that this is not just a pie-in-the-sky national security thinking, it turns out that the state of Massachusetts is thinking about this problem. It's thinking about how to prepare for biological weapons if there is an attack here in Boston or here in Massachusetts. And in fact, the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency hired a student here at the Kennedy School to write his PAE exercise to help them do their BW preparedness plan. I advised it. He's sitting in the front, Greg Koblenz. So here's another publication, Graham, to add to our list,
Great.
which is the Kennedy School PAE, which is the Massachusetts BW preparedness plan. All right. So it's, now,
If we die as a result of an attack, we know who to blame.
right. But we still have, it was a pretty good PAE, but we still got a ways to go, let me tell you. But that's just to tell you that there is starting to be some early work on this, but it's an incredibly hard task, in part because it's so out of the box. Defense policy people are not accustomed to thinking about epidemiology and public health, yet increasingly today they have to, particularly if they want to get serious about reducing America's vulnerability to BW terrorism. Now, last point, what not to do. What not to do is start to curtail civil liberties. A rubric under which many of the efforts today are organized is called Homeland Defense. You'll hear about this more and more. It's something the Department of Defense is starting to use with some regularity to cover the package of efforts to deal with catastrophic terrorism. My basic point is we should pursue Homeland Defense, but we should not start to change the homeland, at least until something bad happens. And when something bad happens, we surely will have to change the homeland. It will force that. But until that threat is manifest, until it actually happens, I don't think we need to do it. Terrorism works by being indistinguishable from the background of activity, from the normal traffic and commerce that goes around every day. Terrorists can strike at any target with any weapon at any time. And our vulnerability is a function of how free we are, of our openness, and of our liberties. This is what makes us vulnerable to terrorism. It also makes us a desirable society, the sort of society we want. Now, the dilemma we face, which Ash pointed out, is that in combating terrorism, many of the things you want to do have the effect of increasing the state's ability to surveil the population or to conduct investigations. We have this notion in America of civil liberties, which are supposed to protect average citizens from that. And so we have this dilemma. As we start to deal with this internal threat, terrorism, we want to start impacting on one of the essential aspects of our society. This temptation exists in spades when we start to work on the catastrophic terrorism problem. And my argument to you tonight is that we should not submit to it. And the reason is that our system of governance was not designed to maximize the efficiency of our national security agencies. If you go back 200 years, our system of governance was designed to protect the citizens from the arbitrary power of the state. And I think this is very, very important. And I would not want, with this threat, which is not yet manifest, it still might emerge. But at this point, I do not think it's justified to begin curtailing our civil liberties. But we need to find avenues where we can make progress, short of that. And there are quite a number. And as Graham said at the beginning, and Ash alluded to, we're only really beginning to map those out and make progress.
Great. Thank you very much, Rich. Our third speaker also teaches here at the Kennedy School, Elaine Kmark, And Elaine, I think, brings to this panel another perspective, especially valuable, since among the many things that she did while in Washington was serve in a major role on first the Vice President's Airline Safety and Security Commission, which looked at the question of airline safety, but then even more important and relevantly, she was a major force in the Olympic planning task force, which addressed the question for the Atlanta Olympics of vulnerabilities to catastrophic terrorism, and which managed to engage the various arms and legs and tentacles of the U.S. government more effectively than one would have otherwise expected. Elaine at the Kennedy School directs the Visions of Governance project and also the Innovations in America project, and she served previously in the White House as a senior policy advisor to Vice President Gore. So, Elaine?
Thank you. Thank you. I come at this topic from a practical experience of trying to reinvent government for 5 years. We dealt with all aspects of the American government. And when I came here to the Kennedy School, one of the very first meetings I had was with Ash, and discovered that one of the interests here was addressing directly a problem that I had worked on in at least 3 different instances in the White House, which was this problem that Ash alluded to. It's really the structure of the government and its ability to not just meet this challenge, but in fact, more importantly, prevent this challenge. Let me start my comments today by just talking in general about the sort of things that government is good at and the sort of things that government isn't good at. Government is usually pretty good in responding to crises, responding to challenges. You know, in the wake of the Northridge earthquake in California, the federal government came together like no one could even imagine to deal with the crisis there, deal with the people there. When you went to town meetings in that part of California after the earthquake and FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, was brought up, people would applaud spontaneously. And, you know, I mean, people very rarely applaud spontaneously about the government. And so, you know, there is a capacity in the government to respond. There is also a capacity to organize around identifiable problems. So, for instance, when we began to work on the Olympics and realized that there were security problems in the Olympics, which due to the sheer size of the Atlanta police force, it had nothing to do with the capacity of the police force, but just the sheer size of it, that were going to transcend the ability of Atlanta or even the state of Georgia to take care of. We managed to pull together a very unique coalition of people from all sorts of places in the government, but a heavy Department of Defense presence. We used people from the Social Security Administration, from the IRS. In other words, we worked across the government as one government in establishing a security structure for the Olympics. And so, but that was because there was an identifiable, you know, event going to take place. There was a history of people trying terrorist attacks there, et cetera. What is the government bad at? Well, primarily we are bad at prevention. And usually the government is bad at prevention because the government is organized in stovepipes. And it's not just in the field of terrorism that we're bad at prevention. We're bad at prevention in all sorts of areas. Usually when you read about a horrific child abuse case in the newspaper, by the time you get to the 6th or 7th paragraph, what you realize is that this child has fallen between the cracks in the social welfare system, and one piece of the system never talked to the other piece of the system, and before you know it, you have a 5-year-old who's dead or beaten, et cetera. Well, it's not terribly different in this area of terrorism. One of the important problems that I believe the Ash's publication and others begin to address is how do we organize the government to see better? How do we organize the government to prevent this as opposed to simply react to this? And that involves getting over some of these divisions, as that Ash referred to, between law enforcement and foreign policy or intelligence agencies, and making a seamless web of the government that can somehow effectively see and prevent, while still retaining the civil liberties and the important values that caused them to be separate in the first place. And this is obviously easier said than actually implemented. The second reason I think that its government has a problem here is that, particularly in the area of terrorism, government officials are actually loath to talk about this. And they're loath to talk about it because, in fact, they don't want to give people ideas. Okay, and so there's lots of things are classified, lots of things are never put in speeches. Even when you have relatively small meetings of academics, people say, oh boy, don't write that. You know, it's loath to talk about it. The irony here, though, is that when you ask the American public, in spite of the government not talking about it, when you ask the American public what their basic security threat is, number one is rogue terrorism. And the American public defines it precisely the way the people who've written about it on this panel define it, as nuclear, biological, some kind of large-scale threat. Now, why are they doing that? Well, partially because it's common sense that this is one of the things happening in the world, and partially because the government may not be talking about this, but Hollywood is. Just go to the movies. Okay? The bad guys in the movies are some breakaway former Soviet republic who've got some horrible weapon of some sort, and it makes for a great movie, etc. And the movies are filled with this stuff. So this is permeating the popular culture. What this brings us to, though, is the fact that the government is really organized for another time and another place and another kind of threats, and a world in which law enforcement was neatly contained within our borders, and threats to American security came from states as opposed to rogue actors, and we could deal with states in the traditional mechanisms of intelligence, foreign policy, and defense. And because of that, the government, I believe, will have to struggle in the next couple of years with how to reinvent its security apparatus to deal with this new threat that doesn't fit neatly in any of the existing boxes. And let me just close with a story that comes from one of these new threats, which overlaps with terrorism, which is the drug world, that Jamie Gorelick told me, who is the number 2 at the Justice Department. She used to have the following conversation with Strobe Talbot, number 2 at the State Department, on a pretty regular basis. The conversation would go like this. He would call her and say, "Your agents want to depose so-and-so. How dare you?" And she would say, "So-and-so is a no-good SOB drug-running type, and we want to get him." And he would say, "So-and-so is the best friend of the Prime Minister." And what you were seeing there was 2 departments, right? 2 different agendas there, one law enforcement, one diplomatic relations, getting to know, kind of getting to get along with another government, clashing, because the world was no longer easily divided between law enforcement within our borders and foreign policy and defense and security interests. And I think that always summed it up for me, the challenge that we're facing in having to think about what the future of the government looks like in this area.
Thank you very much, Elaine. I think that that adds a mix to the picture, and maybe in the questions and answers we'll press you a little bit on the Olympics experience as well, because that probably is the closest the American government has come to trying to think about this issue seriously. And in the course of that, both a good performance, but you and your reinventors identified a lot of blank spots as well. So I maybe come back to that. The final cleanup hitter for today is Matt Messelson, and actually it's good fortune that we have Matt because his domain and Josh Lederberg's overlap considerably, and so he can explain to us anything that Josh would have said, or at least make a comment on it. Matt is the Thomas Dudley Cabot Professor of Natural Sciences here at Harvard in the Department of Molecular and Cellular Biology. He is also the co-director of the Harvard Sussex program on CBW, chemical biological weapons, armaments, and armaments limitations. He's a distinguished biochemist and biologist. He's a scientist for some substantial portion of his life and working day, but over the last almost 25 years, he's focused on chemical and biological weapons as a phenomenon and as a potential threat and as a subject to be addressed in terms of what can be done about it. And of late, and as part of the local work here at the Kennedy School, he and Phil Hyman have come up with a thought about what might actually be done in the domain of biological weapons in a version of what I think of as a big idea. So we're very glad to have Matt as part of the panel.
Thank you, Graham. I too, like Rich, have 3 points I want to make, but I will hold off for a moment while I say something about the difficulty of the problem of the threat of biological weapons, in addition to the difficulties of mobilizing government that Elaine has talked about. The problem itself is particularly difficult because of ignorance with regard both to the nature of the threat and the probability of the threat. Let me illustrate with a few comments. The director of the domestic terrorism part of the FBI testified to the Congress in 1996 that, quote, "Our investigations in the United States reveal no intelligence that state sponsors of terrorism, international terrorist groups, or domestic terrorist groups are currently planning to use these deadly weapons in the United States." And I checked recently, and that assessment is still the assessment of the Bureau today. That means that we don't really have some very specific thing that we can focus on. There may be plans in somebody's head, but it's nothing that we can at this moment say, there's the problem. The second part of the uncertainty is as to the nature of the problem. So many different agents, so many different potential targets. In other words, so many potential attack scenarios. No army is ever faced with a situation like this. In a normal war, for example, there's a front, there are main forces, there's an enemy, he's there. You can make reasonable plans. I'm not saying that one cannot make plans in this area, but I want to emphasize that because of these uncertainties, both as to probabilities and as to nature, we need to be particularly skeptical, cautious, critical, rational, whatever word is most appropriate, and in particularly with respect to 3 things. That brings me to the 3 points I would like to make to maintain symmetry with Rich. The first is we must examine proposed solutions with respect very carefully, especially carefully, with respect to their real effectiveness. Rich mentioned that it's relatively easy to do the medical treatment its own. What's the cure for the common cold? Been working on that for a long time. Baldness, the cancer, I mean, these are not easy things. What is the durability of the proposed solution? In the early 1950s, there was a major BW scare in the United States. An entire issue of the American Journal of Public Health was devoted to the BW threat. Something good came out of it, the creation of the Epidemiological Intelligence Service of the CDC in Atlanta, Georgia. But it didn't get funding for very long. It withered. Now perhaps it's going to get some more money. But by selling it on the grounds that after a while passed from the media, from the government attention, other things came up. We created a good program, but on the basis of a threat that couldn't be maintained on the public mind and therefore didn't have durability. So those measures that we think are important to meet possible threats of biological weapons must have built into them, and I think Rich was referring to that, public health benefits, real ones, And we mustn't deceive our lawmakers by telling them that this is for a threat that they may not be focused on tomorrow. The threat of disease will always be there, and we need to build structures that have durability. And the third aspect that requires that we look at proposed, suggested measures very carefully is that they may have side effects that are detrimental. For example, when we emphasize this threat, Hollywood is one thing, but when responsible government officials emphasize our vulnerability, this can have a different effect than when Hollywood does. Because if there are those out there who mean us ill, it's one thing to see Hollywood saying something, but if the chairman of the Joint Chiefs says publicly, he may be quite right, but if he says publicly, as he did, nothing frightens me more than biological weapons, or if the Secretary of Defense holds a 5-pound bag of sugar and says this could wipe out, well, if anybody's listening, this man is the symbol of what it is that those who wish us ill want to damage. It's different if Hollywood holds a 5-pound bag or has a monster from outer space or who knows what, or an asteroid. But so there are side effects of trying to mobilize public opinion. And doing it that way is something like painting a bullseye on your T-shirt and saying, here, aim. So that's my first point, is we must be careful to examine proposed solutions in a especially careful way. Second is, deal with the context as well as with the problem itself. It was mentioned that Israel and England do well, or did well, have done well, relatively well, in dealing with terrorism. There's a lesson in that. Why did they have terrorism? It was because there were groups who felt seriously infringed upon by England. That's been going on for a couple hundred years, I guess, with respect to Ireland, and Israel. The context is, after all, in Costa Rica, I don't think they're too worried about biological threats. The context is our image in the world. The linkage between our image in the world and what goes on in the minds of people is tight, is strong. We create friends, we create enemies. Some of our national programs create friends, some create enemies. We should design them so as not unnecessarily to create enemies, and as much as possible to create friends, to stand for things that everybody thinks he stands for in the world, and not to stand for things that particularly or unnecessarily affront any one group. And finally, we need to keep, in addition to realizing the context within which this threat is embedded, we need to keep in mind in our planning the longer term. And by longer here, and now I'm going to be, I think, a little misty-eyed, and I'm not sure that my concern here will be borne out, but it's something that needs to be thought about and looked at. I'm going to start with a quotation from an article in the Naval War College Review in 1989. It won the Joint Chiefs of Staff Prize for that year, Prize Essay Prize, and also the Naval War College Prize Essay Prize. And it was written by Commander Stephen Rose, a naval commander, and it was called The Silent Weapons, and it was about biological weapons. And let me read to you a paragraph from Commander Rose's article. The outlook for biological weapons is grimly interesting. Weaponeers have only just begun to explore the potential of the biotechnological revolution. It is sobering to realize that far more development lies ahead than behind. This brings me to the thought that it isn't sociopaths or cults or terrorists or even rogue governments that will determine the shape of history ahead. It is the leading states of the world and the leading ideas of the world. And when we ask, what is the relevance of this to biotechnology, we need to reflect that every major technology in the history of humanity, going all the way back to the first technologies, working with stones, metallurgy, coming more recently, internal combustion, explosives, nucleonics, electronics, every one of those technologies has been used not only for human good, but has been exploited vigorously for hostile purposes. And here we are, civilization continues to exist, even to advance, so we've survived all that. The question this brings us to, though, is biotechnology any different? If it is exploited, not only for human good, of course, it has vast potential in that respect, but if it is, like all predecessor technologies, exploited vigorously for hostile purposes, does that take us down a path quite different from any path that would otherwise be in front of us? Biotechnology, after all, has the possibility not just to invent improved ways of killing people or crops or animals. We've already got pretty good ways of doing that. Unlike all previous technologies, it has the potential to manipulate us, to affect all of the fundamental life processes, development, heredity, cognition. So I leave you with that thought that we need to begin to think of our interests not as a city, not as a nation, but as a species in the application of biotechnology and how to make sure that it is not used in a way that would distort the future course of civilization.
Thank you. I think a good set of introductory remarks, and I thank the panelists especially for being concise. We have, by my watch here, about 34 minutes for comments, questions, and discussion. We'll close directly at 9:30. The microphones are open on the left and right-hand side of the floor here, and I'm going to encourage you to stand up at the microphones, but for the members of the panel, for brief comments on each other's comments, like less than a minute, let me encourage you while people are standing up, because Ash said he had differences of particularly things in which you differ as opposed to things in which you agree.
I think I have some differences with Matt. I know what the FBI says about BW threats, Matt, but the Alm cult worked for years and with a budget of billions of dollars, and in Russia and Japan and the United States, without the knowledge of any law enforcement authorities. Without our knowledge. Why was that? One reason in this country is they were protected by the fact that they were a religion or had a religious affiliation. We have rules on intelligence collection domestically, which we very much value, but there's the explanation. So the fact that we haven't found it does not reassure me. Atlanta. I was very involved in the Atlanta Olympics side, and you know, I guess BW is a little bit like the common cold, and maybe you can say it's too big and too hard to deal with. But when we were preparing for Atlanta, we just went through the list that the law enforcement people go through, looking for what could happen. Elaine probably remembers this. And they look for people who are buying explosives and renting big trucks and so forth. They just have a little, these are gumshoes, and they have a list. And we just wanted to put on the list, are people buying fruit sprayers? Are they buying cultures, anthrax or some other biological culture? So there are things that we can do that raise the barrier. And it's not like curing the common cold. It's prudence. And will silence help us? I've wrestled with that a lot myself. I think everybody involved in counterterrorism has wrestled. And my problem with silence on this question is that, that an event occurs, then the silence is broken. But in that climate, everybody's gone crazy. And this country, everybody wants to turn the country upside down, look under every mattress for everybody who, I fear that environment so much that I would rather take the risk now of getting out in front of the problem. Is our behavior relevant, our government's behavior on the large relevant to this? I'm not so sure. You know, the biggest terrorist groups in our country are the militias. Now, I don't think the militias' complaints about our society are well-grounded. Maybe the Irish complaints against the British government are well-grounded, but I don't think the militias and the are well-grounded. You have to accept the fact that there are groups out there that don't have a very good reason for wanting to do this and might want to do it. Final thing about Atlanta. which illustrates how serious the problem is of getting ourselves together on this. Elaine probably remembers this. The FBI came to us in DOD and said, can we bring our hostage response team down to Fort Bragg where your counterterrorism people are? We have counterterrorism people in DOD who deal with foreign, Achille Lauro and so forth. And we are relentless in this. If you remember, we got some of the people who did the Achille Lauro, the Leon Klinghoffer killings. We follow these people forever. You kill Americans and we will be after you forever. You're on a list and we pursue you everywhere around the world. This fellow who killed Leon Klinghoffer made the mistake of going fishing in international waters. And he did. He went fishing one day, then next thing he knew, he was on a little ship that went to an aircraft carrier and then to an airplane, and he was continuously mid-air refueled all the way to Marion Prison in Illinois. And he probably thought that that was something he had done in his youth, and he had children now, and he was going fishing. No, we follow you relentlessly and doggedly. And so the FBI's hostage rescue people, the Waco people, went down to see our Achille Lauro people, DOD people. And their lawyers came with them, the Department of Justice lawyers. And the Special Operations Forces showed them what they do if you're on an airplane and you get hijacked. And the FBI people came back to Washington and said, well, we can't use their tactics. Now, why is that? When our people, if you're hijacked in a foreign land and Americans storm your airplane, anybody who moves gets shot. There's no Miranda rights, there's nothing like that. They're trying to save as many lives as they can, and they will, their rules of engagement are very, very direct. You saw what happened in Peru not so many months ago. All the hostage takers get killed. There are no arrests, that's not the objective. But the objective of the hostage rescue team was different, and their rules of law enforcement. So there you saw two cultures. And obviously we don't want the culture of special operations in Beirut to be applied in our country. So the problem's really very deep, and if we don't admit it now and get on top of it now and get out in front of it now, we'll confront those two cultures in the aftermath of an event that has caused us hysteria.
Okay. I don't want to promote too much debate in the panel, otherwise we won't have any questions. But on Atlanta, maybe, Elaine, you were in the middle of that. Do you want to say anything about what worked and what didn't work? Yeah.
Again, it's the ability to project, and if there is a problem that you can see, then the government has its ways of making this all happen. So we knew about 6 months before the Olympics that the planning that the city was doing was inadequate to the security risks facing the Olympics. And among the other things we went to DOD for was, not in addition to the help with counterterrorism, et cetera, was things like we had Army enlisted personnel driving every bus into the Olympic Center. You had to park all the way around the perimeter, and then everybody was bussed in. There were Army personnel on the subways and as drivers of all the official buses. So what happened was we were in fact using Department of Defense personnel in a domestic law enforcement kind of capacity, or crowd kind of capacity. There was a lot of patrolling of perimeters of the various sites. They were done by military personnel. Now, when we began these conversations, the military didn't want to do it. I mean, they just absolutely didn't want to do it. They were running up against posse comitatus. They absolutely didn't want to do it. Nor did any of the other federal personnel want to get involved in this. They were afraid that they would run into restrictions on their appropriations, that their appropriations were to do one thing, collect income taxes, issue Social Security cards, whatever, and that they would be illegally spending their money if they helped if they helped out essentially the Justice Department, police the Olympics. What happened, though, was because the threat was there, you could see it, okay? We knew that there was a potential for a lot of danger and a lot of mischief in the Olympics. Magically, laws were found, precedents were found, the lawyers kind of sat down and they kind of worked it out. You know, they worked out the arrangements. And that's my bigger point about we're pretty good at doing this when we can predict it. It's when we can't predict it, which was Ash's point, that, and the ability to prevent it, that I think cause all the people on this panel to be concerned with the problem and with the government response.
Good. I'm going to move to the floor. Let me ask you to put your questions succinctly. Identify yourself, and we're starting with this gentleman.
My name is Alexander Rossolimo. I'm with the Center for Security and Social Progress. My question is focused on the role of the private sector. Now, U.S. companies have subsidiaries all over the world, including some high-risk regions like the Middle East and the former Soviet Union, for instance. And with globalization and increased international trade, there's a rather unfettered flow of goods, services, and know-how across national boundaries. This can include computer viruses, but also potential weapons of mass destruction. So my question is, what steps should business, industry, and companies take to address the challenge of catastrophic terrorism?
Okay. Let's see if we can, one person can say who, if they want to answer, Rich, and then we'll see if others disagree.
Well, let me just illustrate one dimension of that, and it's getting back to the notion of BW response through the medical system. It turns out in America, surveilling for outbreaks of disease is a public function. It's a service we provide through the CDC, working with many state and local public health authorities. But the actual provision of health care is done by and large by private entities, by privately owned hospitals and by privately owned insurance companies and HMOs. And so one question that actually is being worked now, and people are looking at these difficult nexuses, is to what extent can you rely on a private insurance company or a private hospital to involve itself in a national security event like a biological weapons attack? Are they going to close their hospitals? Are they going to think this is a reimbursable expense? This is a serious question. And if the answer is no, then what's the alternative? And the only viable alternative at this point, short of nationalizing the healthcare system overnight, is the U.S. military. So it is, in fact, this public-private is another very difficult seam in the response.
Elaine, you're
Yeah.
exploring which things should be privatized
Right.
and which should be public. So
Well,
what
I'll
about
tell you
one?
where this issue was addressed directly, which is in the President's Commission on Information Terrorism, which was called the Marsh Commission, because I guess it was Tom Marsh was the head of it. But reading the Marsh Commission report, which I did about a year ago, and I read the unclassified version, so I suspect that the classified version was even more strong in this point. What you saw was that the basic difficulty there was as follows: that in order to prevent cyber terrorism, as we call it, you needed a certain amount of trust and a certain amount of sharing of information about systems between the private sector and the public sector. For the private sector, this is bread and butter. This is how they make their living. They don't trust each other, certainly. They don't want to give up any secrets to each other, and they don't trust the government either to adequately protect their proprietary secrets. So you have here a problem of a reluctance to share the data, a reluctance to share who's being tapped into, who's being attacked, from where, etc., in any central place, so that in fact some governmental entity could perhaps track this down. Now, it just so happens there's a new novel out about this by, of course, Tom Clancy, called NetForce, right? Which is all predicated around a government agency that does nothing but this. And of course, it takes place in 2010. And part of the reason we're having this panel is that some of us think maybe we ought not to wait for the, first massive disruption of computer networks in 2010 to have somebody do this.
Good. Here on the left.
The world.
Please identify yourself. too.
Yes. My name is Alex Papali. I'm a member of the community concerned about these issues. The world that we are allowed to see in this country is completely different from, the actual world out there. To make my point, let me just read something from the March 28th issue of the New York Times Magazine. Here's the cover. It's a picture of a fist painted in the American flag colors. A little quote from inside. "The American burden, the hidden hand of the market will never work without a hidden fist. McDonald's cannot flourish without McDonnell Douglas, the designer of the F-15. And the hidden fist that keeps the world safe for Silicon Valley's technologies is called the United States Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps." Translation, anywhere there's a good chunk of money to be made in the world, we will defend American multinationals' right to exploit it, and the people, who happen to live in those communities, Shell in Nigeria, all the oil companies in East Timor, in Burma, the Dene people in Peabody Coal exploiting Big Mountain in Arizona. I just want to point out that as long as you people continue your violent, selfish, arrogant, and frankly childish ways in the world, outside and domestically, you can expect a form of terrorism, if you want to call it that, But it's retaliation, it's self-defense, and Mr. Messelson touched on the point, but it's a very valid point that you frankly haven't considered.
Thank you. I think a good statement, and I think it goes to a point that Matt Messelson addressed. So Matt, let me see if you want to make a comment, and then if Ash wants to agree or disagree. Yeah.
Well, I think that to the extent that we ask which countries have experienced terrorism, and it hasn't largely been from cults, it has been because of their foreign activities. I don't see the United States the way you described it, but I do see that we have ideals that we need to project better in the world and live up to better ourselves that we've tended to stray from. I remember when President Truman proposed the so-called Point 4 program, which never came into existence, but it inspired people all over the world. We've become pretty tight with our money. We're rich enough now, so we shouldn't be quite that tight. On the point of the difficulty of recognizing the target, the reason I said that we don't know what's in people's minds was precisely because of things like, by the way, that first attack was even published in the Herald Tribune. It was an AP dispatch, the one before Tokyo, and when a representative of our intelligence community testified before the Senate, he admitted that this was even in the newspapers. So my very point, and the reason I said that whatever the FBI may not know about, still we don't know what's in people's heads, was to emphasize that it's very difficult to identify the nature of the problem, where it's coming from if there is one, not only what the probability is, but where it is. It's like there's no light in the room. It's very hard to deal with that. So my only point was not to say that there isn't something going on somewhere. Maybe there is, but the problem has this strange quality to it that requires a rather different way of examining the proposals. And I do think it's very difficult to deal with these things medically. We don't have antidotes. There aren't medicines which, if you just have them, will cure someone who has just come down with anthrax, let alone with a lot of other diseases. It isn't easy. We need to work on those things, largely because they are public health threats, as Rich said. As far as the point that Graham alluded to about something that Phil Hyman and I and Julian Robinson and others have worked on, we've tried to see how we could influence people who command great resources, namely heads of state, leaders, people whose politics may be determined by the way we are in the world, but once they're in power, can do destructive things. And although this is certainly not a solution, it might help if we could rely a little bit more on international criminal law to hold even highly placed people responsible if they should do things that are universally recognized as abhorrent to all, such as using disease as a weapon. And so we've tried to develop a treaty that would be like the airline hijacking treaty and certain other treaties which are designed to make international criminal law that is universal jurisdiction so that you can try an offender regardless of whether he's a citizen of your country, regardless of whether the crime was committed, so long as he appears on your soil, so that we could include in that body of criminal law the offense of making or using biological weapons. And there is that possibility. That might help a bit.
Okay. I'll make one quick comment on the question, and then we'll go back over here. While I remember the New York Times story that was on Friedman's globalism, I think the the comment, which I disagree with in half, in half I agree with. So this is, I think the current American conception of national security, in which bombing has become the instrument of first choice, and we reach out and bomb people as if we were living on a different planet, is delusional. This would be my view. That, as the Secretary of Defense has said, so this is not like you're telling a secret, if you notice that, as Ash pointed out, if the U.S. is dominant on one chessboard, it would be stupid to continue playing on that same chessboard, and the last few thousand years of history, opponents have, after making a few mistakes, discovered that reacting asymmetrically is appropriate. So I think one of the reasons why the threat of terrorist actions against the U.S. grows is that if and as the U.S. uses military power abroad to hurt other people, it's not surprising that they might consider what their alternatives are. And since they don't include fighting in the main front, they may include other alternatives. So I think that's a reason why this issue looms larger. I think we, of course, all worry about suggesting bad ideas for somebody to do something that they might not otherwise have thought of. But I think it would be foolish to imagine that people couldn't figure these things out for themselves or in sufficient numbers. We'll go to this gentleman.
My name is James Williamson, and that's kind of not a bad introduction to the question that I was going to ask, which is the following. I wonder if I'd be interested to hear any of the panelists who would care to comment. Does any of you consider that it's a fair or accurate description of the attack on the pharmaceutical plant in the Sudan as a terrorist attack? Do you consider it to have been justified at the time that it was carried out, and now what is your view of it in retrospect from what is known or what has not been able to be confirmed? There are maybe people who know whether it's been confirmed or not. And for that matter, are the other leading examples that critics have pointed to, the sanctions in Iraq against a background of the destruction of water infrastructure, pure water infrastructure that has led to people have called that biological warfare, and more recently the bombing in the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, where we have seen repeatedly the dismembered body parts of civilians in trains, buses, and convoys. And is that not a form of terrorism?
Well, it's a tough question. Who wants to answer that one?
Well, I'll take the first part of it. I think the airstrike on Sudan, the pharmaceutical part, is certainly not an act of terrorism. It was a use of force. It was probably illegal under international law, since international law, in principle, force can only be used in self-defense or when authorized by the Security Council. But I think in no sense was it a terrorist attack, though an international law would say it's probably illegal.
Ash, do you want to come in?
Just to say that I think you're raising a very serious and legitimate question about the definition of terrorist. One person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, and simply labeling somebody a terrorist doesn't put you on the right side of the issue. That's a serious. There are people who have thought seriously about that dilemma and have some things to say about that, like, for example, in the case of the IRA, that since the United Kingdom is a democracy, that there's an alternative to the Irish Republicans, an alternative to violence, and they've chosen violence over that alternative. Therefore, presumptively, their case is more wrong than it would be were they operating in a society where a democratic option was an alternative. And that's just an example of the way you try to reason your way through who is the terrorist here. But I don't rule out that governments can behave terroristically. It's a label, and the label doesn't by itself put you on the right side of the issue.
Okay.
Anybody care to comment on whether the pharmaceutical plant, 50% of the pharmaceuticals supposedly were being produced there. That's 50% of medical needs that are obliterated in an instant. Does anyone care to comment on whether it looks like, after all has said and done, that in fact there were precursors or whatever that justified the attack on that particular facility, even though just 2 days ago the assets were unfrozen?
Matt, do you?
Well, I can't comment on whether the so-called precursors were actually present, but there's some methodological things one can say. The first is, by the way, it seems that it's going to enter the legal system, the courts. There's a lawsuit, and that's probably a good thing. The information will be produced. What I have to say is more narrowly technical, and that is that people who deal with forensic chemistry know that you should really have at least 2 labs who analyze any sample to see if they agree. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in The Hague, the organization that runs the Chemical Weapons Treaty, needs to be able to analyze chemical samples, environmental samples, for particular chemicals. So they have a set of, I think, 7 different countries who have laboratories which have volunteered to be available to the OPCW to do that kind of chemical analysis. But in order to be ready to do it, they have to first show that they're capable of doing it. So they've been running capability tests. And they make up samples in The Hague, and then they divide them into portions and send 1 portion to each lab. And these are all very fine labs. One of them in Britain is, I would have thought, the best. And yet, they've now gone through 7 cycles of this. They finally got it to where when they send out samples, all the labs agree. But for the first 6 times, there were labs that would find false positives, good labs. Labs would find false negatives. So what I distill out of this is that our government ought to have at least 2 labs, like a red team and a blue team at least, that would protect the government against serious mistakes just based on, I'm only commenting on the technical aspect, not on the political aspect. But I think there's a tendency on the part of non-scientists to believe that anybody who's holding a test tube and says it turned blue has got to be completely right about his conclusions. And chemistry doesn't work that well.
Okay, back here on the left.
Yeah, I'm Richard Sobel, and I study public opinion and foreign policy, and Graham, at least in the past, has appreciated some factual background. I worked on a study, and as Lane Kmark mentioned, when we ask people about threats to vital interests, international terrorism comes at the top. But it's interesting to know when unprompted, asking people what the biggest foreign policy problems are, answer number 1 is don't know. And this is both an indication of people's lack of knowledge in foreign policy, but also an indication that people don't see a lot of problems on the world horizon. Number 2 was terrorism. Number 3 is the world economy. Apropos the solutions, potential solutions to terrorism, the highest solution the American public chose was diplomatic efforts to apprehend suspects, trials of suspects in international courts, and diplomatic efforts to improve U.S. relations with potential adversary countries. Airstrikes and troops were significantly down. Flora Lewis wrote a column about the war on terrorism. Let me paraphrase. I have a copy of this if anybody wants to read the whole thing. She says, the newly proclaimed war on terrorism is taking a shrill, hyper-menacing tone that cannot help the United States deal with the problem. Some commentators seem almost gleeful at finding a dangerous new enemy to take the place of the Cold War threat. I'd be interested in the panel's response to any of the public opinion data, but particularly the question of whether, and this was sort of alluded to earlier, with the Cold War over, in some sense, the issue of terrorism has risen because, as most people say, they don't know and they don't see on the horizon a problem. In some ways, having this horizon, this problem fills a void.
Well, that article was a comment on Ash's article, so Ash should probably take it.
Yeah. Well, Flora Lewis
his
is
book.
wrong. She's wrong because she doesn't understand that the issue of our time is not finding threats that are upon us. Fortunately, that's not, we live in blessed times in many ways since the Cold War. So the name of the game today is not to go out and look for bad guys. The name of we don't have many, fortunately, opponents. So paranoia is not the order of the day. The order of the day is to have the wisdom and the foresight to understand that even though we live in peaceful times in this country, that's not a birthright. That's not a law of nature. It's something we have to keep earning. And the way you earn that is to think ahead to what might bring this era to an abrupt end and try to stave it off. Now, Flora Lewis may be over in Kosovo right now, and I would submit to you, or wherever she finds the fire of the day, and I would submit to you that it is she who has lost her way, and not I who have lost my way, about what the essence of this era is. So I read that, and I couldn't disagree more. Your numbers, which are interesting about the way people think about foreign policy, and sadly they reveal that people don't actually think about foreign policy very much, but they somewhat evade the issue because, and the previous questioner also made some good points, but you were again thinking of the outside, threats outside coming in. It was like they're all out there, these mustachioed guys, and they're not Saddam Hussein, but they're other foreigners. Not necessarily the case. Remember, the greatest terrorist threat to America is Americans. They're here. They're in Columbine High School. They're in the militias. It is not foreigners. These are among us. That's the part about this that is particularly unsettling. This is not about us and the world only. It's partly about that. Foreign terrorism is that, but this is us against ourselves and the kind of people we breed in our own country and the kind of society we've created around ourselves that can cause people to have this violent reaction to the society in which they live. It's that aspect that is, to me, particularly unsettling, because I'm not used to thinking of.
So
America.
quick comment by Elaine.
Yeah, all I want to say, and it takes in a couple of the comments here, which is that I think the fear, I mean, obviously the United States should try not to make enemies in the world. Obviously, I totally agree with Dr. Messelson. We're very rich. We should be spending a lot more of our money helping other countries in the world. I mean, you know, there's a lot of things we should be doing. But the fear here is a new fear. And go to Littleton. Years and years ago, 2 kids like that, unhappy, maybe mentally ill, maybe evil, whatever your interpretation is, would have gotten into school, taken some bricks, thrown them through the cafeteria window, started a fight, okay? They might have wreaked havoc. They wouldn't have had automatic weapons, okay? And the terrorism analogy is like that as well, which is that suddenly what information technology does is give people who come out of nowhere, okay, who have problems with us that we can't anticipate, we can't understand. And because of the development of technology, those people can do things to us that are seriously harm lots and lots of people. That's new. It used to be that only states could inflict large amounts of damage. Now, small groups of people hallucinating a, problem here or there can get their hands on a technology, and we can't necessarily predict that, and that's the frightening thing, I think, that leads people to think about these problems.
Okay, we have 2 minutes and we have 2 questioners left, so if I could get you to do short questions and short answers. Yep.
My name is Junko Nushi. I'm Kennedy School student, and I'm working in Japanese police force. So we experienced terrorist attack by Aum Shinrikyo, and actually we had underestimated the strength of their technological power in many ways. So if these attacks by cultists happened in the United States, do you think you can do much more preventive ways, or what institution or how?
It's a very good question. It's a wonderful thing, a school where we might have an opportunity to hear from somebody from the Japanese police force on such an event. Let me
A woman from the Japanese police
Yes,
force.
absolutely. Let me be very quick on that answer and to go to the next one. I would say, as Matt Messelson has already suggested, when this question came up in the U.S. government and the representative from CIA was asked to testify to Senator Nunn about this question, he said correctly that the U.S. government, in all of the tentacles that he was able to identify, that is CIA, FBI, Defense Department, had never heard of Shinrikyo at all, never heard of it at all when Shinrikyo attempted its attack on the Japanese government that killed people in the Tokyo subway. Now, what was remarkable about that was that Shinrikyo had already conducted an earlier weapons attack in Matsumoto. This had happened as a fact, so it wasn't like a hypothetical or that they could have imagined it, and this actually had been reported in the newspaper. So the U.S. government, I'm afraid, is not the great hope on this subject yet, and in fact, I think probably if Shinrikyo had attacked the U.S. government might not have been more effective at that point than the Japanese government was. Since then, a lot more attention is being paid and a lot more effort is being made, both in the U.S. and in Japan. Let me go to this gentleman for the last question.
Thanks. My name is Mark Snyder. I'm a student at the business school. My comment is this, and my question is this. It's surprising to me that throughout this hour and a half, we've had the discussion of catastrophic events, and no one has talked about the threat of ballistic missile attack and the need for some sort of defense against ballistic missile attack. And I was wondering if perhaps one of you can address that, particularly as you think about trouble spots like Korea, a breakaway republic in Russia, you have China, Iraq, which all could pose very, very real threats in the near future.
I'm going to ask Ash, who's been recently working on Korea, among other things, but who, when he was a very young man, wrote a study on missile defense. Give us a short answer.
I think the short answer is that long-range ballistic missile technology is not falling into as rapidly into smaller and smaller numbers of hands. It still requires a substantial, organized, relatively visible effort to mount a ballistic missile program. That's point number one, and that's still largely the province of nation states to do that, although even nation states as poor as North Korea. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't defend ourselves against them. It's just not a sub-state or terroristic kind of problem. Secondly, terrorists have no motive. Why go to all that trouble to launch something 10,000 kilometers with a 1,500 kilometer apogee when you can put it in a Federal Express box or a DHL box and it'll arrive with higher probability in 2 days?
Well, my question was focused on states like North Korea. Of course, a terrorist group isn't going to resort to a long-range ballistic missile, but a country like North Korea, which is demonstrating through its missile launch over Japan this summer, that does have that technology.
Right. I agree with you, but that is just outside of the box of terrorism as defined here.
Let me hold that for discussion after. Let me say, in closing, just 2 quick points. First, one might wonder where do all these books come from and where can you get them? Karen, let me get you to come up here just for a second to the microphone. The BCSIA publication series, Karen Motley does the work on, so let's just say thank you very much to her. If you're interested in books, ask her afterwards for a panel giving us a good overview of this topic, a topic which we'll come back to many times here at the school. We hope before the event, but also after. Thank you very much.
During.
Good. You were good.
Scratching the